The year was 1942. Across the war-torn skies of Europe, the roar of engines filled the clouds, a symphony of destruction and desperation. Smoke trailed behind fighter planes as they danced between life and death, a deadly ballet choreographed by the chaos of war. Amid this tumult, there emerged a plane that would not soar with elegance or speed, but stumble, falter, and almost beg for mercy from the very air it sought to conquer. It was the embodiment of ambition gone tragically wrong, steel and canvas welded into a form meant to dominate the skies but instead inviting ridicule from allies and enemies alike. In the early dawns, pilots climbed into cockpits with trembling hands, staring at instruments that seemed almost apologetic in their simplicity. Ground crews whispered tales of its failures, eyes haunted by the memory of countless test flights ending in flames or spiraling crashes. This was a machine born of necessity, desperation, and flawed engineering, intended to tip the scales of air superiority but instead becoming a symbol of wartime folly. As clouds shrouded the horizon, its silhouette against the rising sun looked more like a wounded bird than a fighter jet, its wings awkward, its frame fragile, a ghostly figure struggling to survive in a sky that showed no mercy. Even the enemy paused in disbelief at the sight of this aircraft, unsure whether to attack immediately or mock its absurdity from afar. Stories of pilots abandoning missions, of engines coughing and dying mid-flight, of machine guns jamming at the worst possible moments, spread like wildfire. And yet, despite its flaws, it was flown, because war leaves no room for perfection, only for the courage to face failure head-on, no matter how humiliating. The stage was set, the skies trembling, and history was about to witness one of the most catastrophic aerial misadventures ever recorded. The moment you first laid eyes on this fighter, there was a sinking feeling in your chest, as if the sky itself was judging the audacity of its design. On the ground, it looked deceptively solid, a hulking mass of metal, rivets, and bracing struts, a promise of power in the midst of war. But appearances were cruelly deceiving. Every line of its fuselage, every curve of its wings, seemed to defy both aerodynamics and common sense. Engineers had intended a masterpiece, a plane that would dominate the skies, outpace enemies, and turn the tide of aerial combat. But what emerged from the factories was a machine of contradictions, a limping giant in a world that demanded agility, precision, and ruthless efficiency. From the first moment of takeoff, it betrayed its own purpose. Pilots, trained to master machines of war with confidence and poise, found themselves wrestling with a creation that seemed determined to resist every command. The engine, meant to roar with the might of a lion, wheezed like a dying animal, coughing, spluttering, and shuddering under the slightest demand for speed. The propeller, too small and poorly calibrated, fought against the very air it was supposed to conquer, slicing through the wind only to tremble and shiver under the stress of its own rotation. Every attempt to lift from the runway became an exercise in terror, as the plane lumbered awkwardly, bouncing on its landing gear, as though mocking the pilot's skill and courage. Once airborne, its deficiencies became painfully obvious. The wings, long on paper but structurally flawed in reality, flexed unnaturally with every maneuver, sending vibrations through the entire fuselage. The pilot could feel the plane groaning, protesting every tilt of the yoke, every push of the throttle. The aircraft responded sluggishly, as if mired in invisible molasses, each command arriving late, incomplete, and half-hearted. Rolling left or right required immense effort, banking into turns became a negotiation with gravity itself, and climbing to a useful altitude felt like coaxing a mule up a mountainside. In comparison to the sleek, responsive fighters it was meant to rival, this aircraft was a lumbering relic, a steel and fabric mockery of what aerial combat demanded. Engineers had attempted to pack firepower into its frame, but the armaments were either too heavy, too poorly mounted, or too prone to jamming. Guns that should have roared with destruction coughed instead, spitting smoke and frustration. Ammunition belts jammed at critical moments, leaving the pilot helpless as enemy aircraft swarmed with lethal efficiency. The cockpit itself, meant to be a pilot's sanctuary, felt like a coffin, cramped and unyielding, with instruments that rattled and flickered, as if the machine was aware of its own inadequacy. Even seasoned aviators, those who had faced the deadliest fighters in the war, could not disguise the cold sweat of anxiety as they gripped the controls, knowing that every mission in this aircraft was a gamble with fate itself. It wasn't just its performance that struck fear into those who flew it, it was the sheer unpredictability of the machine. One flight might be slightly bearable, the engines whining but manageable, the wings trembling yet still holding, the weapons firing with grudging cooperation. The next flight could descend into chaos within minutes, the aircraft jerking violently, the nose dropping or the tail swaying without warning. Pilots reported feeling as though the plane had a mind of its own, a stubborn refusal to comply with human intent. In combat simulations and early sorties, it became a running joke among squadrons, whispered about in mess halls and hangars: if you survive the takeoff, congratulations. Everything else is optional. But the humor was bitter, tinged with fear and frustration, because every joke carried the memory of comrades who had perished, planes lost to mechanical failures rather than enemy fire. Engineers tried to make modifications, reinforcing the wings, tweaking the engines, rebalancing the armaments, but each alteration revealed new flaws. Strengthening one area made another weaker. Speed was sacrificed for stability, only for stability to collapse under stress. It was a Sisyphean struggle, a machine whose failures multiplied no matter how carefully humans tried to contain them. Witnessing it in flight was almost surreal. From the ground, it looked like a bird with broken wings, laboring to gain altitude while the wind whipped around it, as if the atmosphere itself rejected its form. Pilots often reported that the plane would lurch unpredictably, banking too sharply or resisting a turn entirely, forcing them to overcorrect in a dance with gravity that could easily end in disaster. Enemy fighters, sleek and deadly, swooped around it effortlessly, circling and firing with precision, while this pathetic aircraft could only shudder and tremble under attack. Even in formation flights, where multiple units were meant to coordinate, this fighter became the weak link, its sluggish responses dragging the squadron down, endangering others as well as its own pilot. Ground crews, who had painstakingly prepared it for missions, sometimes looked on in silent despair as engines coughed to life, landing gear groaned under load, and flaps refused to respond. Their hearts sank, knowing the odds were stacked against those brave souls who would climb into the cockpit. And yet, despite its failings, the plane flew. It defied the impossible in one sense. It existed, it was airborne, and it could, on rare occasions, return from a mission intact. But its flight was never elegant, never confident, it was a limping, hesitant, faltering testament to engineering gone tragically awry. The psychological toll on the pilots cannot be overstated. Flying a fighter is already an act of courage, but flying this particular model was a daily confrontation with fear, frustration, and the uncanny sensation of being trapped in a machine that could betray you at any moment. Veterans who survived missions often spoke of gripping the yoke with white-knuckled intensity, every muscle tense, every thought focused on survival rather than strategy. They learned to anticipate failures before they happened, to read the subtle signs of structural weakness, engine strain, and mechanical protest, almost as if listening to the machine whisper its own warnings. Yet even with this intimate understanding, each flight was a trial, a precarious balance between human skill and mechanical treachery. The aircraft was never a partner in battle, it was an unpredictable adversary, its flaws magnified in moments of stress, its weaknesses brutally exposed by the slightest miscalculation. And still, this plane remained a part of the war effort, a reluctant participant in a conflict that demanded heroes and miracles. It embodied the tragic intersection of necessity, ambition, and flawed execution. On paper, it promised dominance. In reality, it delivered a spectacle of failure, a lumbering monument to what happens when engineering falls short of expectation in the unforgiving skies of war. Every sortie, every flight, every landing was a dramatic act, a small miracle if it returned intact. Its infamy spread not just through pilots' accounts, but in whispered tales among enemy forces, who found it difficult to reconcile its intended threat with its actual inadequacy. It was laughed at, cursed, feared, and pitied, all at once. And in that strange, haunting combination of emotions, it earned its place in history as one of the most pathetic fighters ever conceived, a machine that challenged not only the limits of technology but the very nerve and courage of the humans who dared to fly it. Once the aircraft left the tarmac, the terror began in earnest. There was no gentle transition from ground to air, no comforting sense of power lifting you effortlessly above the battlefield. Instead, the plane shuddered violently as if protesting its own existence, every vibration through the fuselage a stark reminder that the human pilot had stepped into a fragile cage of metal and desperation. The engine, which was supposed to roar with confidence, sputtered and groaned, its wheezing coughs echoing like warnings through the cockpit. Propellers spun with uneven rhythm, generating an unsettling resonance that shook instruments and rattled nerves alike. Every command of the yoke required immense effort, each adjustment met with a delayed and unpredictable response. The plane would bank to the left only to jerk sharply back, as though possessed by some mischievous spirit, forcing the pilot into a frantic dance of overcorrection and hope. To climb, the pilot had to coax the engines with exaggerated precision, coaxing life from pistons and crankshafts that seemed determined to betray their own function. In moments when the plane did manage to climb, it was never steady. It rose in fits and starts, stuttering as if unsure of whether it wanted to reach altitude at all. The air itself became an enemy. Even a mild gust could turn the aircraft into a helpless projectile, tilting and rocking violently as the wings flexed unnaturally. Pilots spoke of feeling trapped inside an unruly beast, every muscle tensed in anticipation of disaster. Turbulence was not just uncomfortable, it was deadly. The wings creaked under stress, sending vibrations that threatened to loosen rivets or tear panels free. Flaps hesitated or refused to move altogether, rudders sometimes ignored input, and the throttle responded inconsistently, alternating between sluggish compliance and sudden bursts that threatened to flip the aircraft entirely. Every maneuver, whether a gentle turn or an evasive roll, felt like negotiating with gravity itself, a battle of wills against a machine that refused to obey. Even experienced aces, those who had flown the fastest, most lethal fighters of the war, found themselves trembling behind the controls, hearts racing, knuckles white, fully aware that a single misjudgment could be fatal. Combat was a nightmare. This aircraft, intended to dominate the skies, was instead helpless against even moderately skilled enemy pilots. Dogfights turned into humiliating tests of survival, a stark contrast to the lethal efficiency expected of a frontline fighter. Opponents could circle, dive, and fire with precision while this machine struggled to maintain level flight. Its sluggishness made it impossible to dodge attacks, and the weapons were prone to malfunction at the worst possible moments. Pilots recounted moments when guns jammed just as an enemy aircraft swept into firing range, forcing desperate evasive maneuvers that often proved futile. Every sortie became a high-stakes trial, a deadly equation where pilot skill was often negated by the mechanical incompetence of the aircraft itself. In this sky, survival was more about luck than talent, more about hope than design, and the mere act of staying airborne felt like a small, defiant victory against overwhelming odds. The psychological toll on pilots was immense. Unlike other fighters, which could inspire confidence and courage, this aircraft instilled dread from the first moment of takeoff. Each flight began with a silent prayer, a bracing for failure, a mental checklist not only of the mission but of the plane's capricious behavior. Pilots spoke of the terror of anticipating mechanical failure mid-flight, the mental gymnastics required to stay calm while knowing the plane could betray them in an instant. They learned to read the subtle signs of impending disaster: a cough from the engine, a shudder in the wings, a hesitation in the control surfaces. The cockpit became a cage, a space where every sound, every vibration, every flicker of the instruments was a potential omen. And yet, despite this constant fear, they flew. They flew because there was no alternative, because the war demanded presence in the skies even if the machine itself seemed to mock their courage. The bravery was not in daring maneuvers or bold attacks, but in simply enduring the flight without succumbing to panic. Each mission highlighted the aircraft's catastrophic limitations in new ways. High-speed chases revealed the plane's sluggish engine response, its inability to reach altitudes where engagement would be advantageous. Attempts at evasive maneuvers often ended in spins or stalls, forcing the pilot to expend precious energy just to recover control. Engine temperatures soared under stress, oil pressure fluctuated dangerously, and structural weaknesses became apparent as metal groaned and rivets loosened under repeated strain. In training exercises, instructors were often horrified as pilots struggled to maintain formation or perform basic aerial tactics. Even in clear skies with minimal wind, the plane's flaws were unforgiving, turning routine practice into a series of micro-disasters. The cumulative effect of these failures was more than mechanical, it was emotional, eroding confidence, creating anxiety, and instilling a pervasive fear that the next flight could be the last. What made it especially tragic was its stubborn persistence. Unlike a fighter that might be immediately grounded for severe flaws, this aircraft continued to fly. Pilots were forced into the air in missions where the plane's performance could mean life or death, compelled by necessity and the relentless pressure of wartime demands. There were rare moments when the engines roared with partial competence, when the wings held firm and the guns discharged with fleeting precision. In those brief instants, pilots could almost forget the machine's failings and imagine what it was meant to be. But the illusion never lasted. Almost immediately, the plane would lurch, the engine would cough, or the wings would flex alarmingly, a harsh reminder that it was, at best, a work in perpetual failure. Each flight became a testament not to technological triumph but to human resilience, the courage to operate a machine that refused to cooperate, to face enemies with a compromised weapon, and to return to base against overwhelming odds. Enemy pilots also took notice. They did not initially understand whether to treat it as a threat or a joke. It lumbered across the sky with a vulnerability that was almost comical, yet there was an undeniable danger in its unpredictability. It could stall in awkward patterns, spiral uncontrollably, or suddenly surge with unanticipated bursts of speed, moments that could make a skilled adversary miscalculate and falter. Still, the consensus was clear: this was not a fighter to fear in terms of combat prowess. It was a hazard to its own pilots, a living paradox of danger and absurdity, and its presence on the battlefield became a grim morale factor, both for those who flew it and those who witnessed its failings from the ground. Histories of the war recount incidents where entire squadrons hesitated to form close formations with this aircraft, knowing that its unpredictable behavior could jeopardize even the most meticulously planned missions. Pilots' personal accounts are haunting. They describe gripping the yoke with teeth clenched, every nerve screaming, as the aircraft faltered under maneuvers that would have been routine for any other plane. They recount moments of sheer panic when engines failed mid-ascent, forcing a desperate glide back to the airstrip. Control surfaces would ignore commands, leaving them spinning uncontrollably or diving too steeply. Sometimes, the plane's own momentum or weight distribution would betray the pilot, causing sudden, violent shifts in attitude. The cockpit was a chamber of constant tension, each flight a microcosm of terror, endurance, and improbable skill. To survive in this aircraft required not just piloting ability but an intimate understanding of its quirks, flaws, and idiosyncrasies, a knowledge that often came at the cost of near misses and, tragically, lost comrades. Despite all this, it remained in service. Its persistence was a testament to desperation as much as to design. The aircraft was a product of wartime pressure, engineers racing against time, production demands outweighing thorough testing, and a military command willing to field an imperfect tool rather than none at all. And yet, its failures became legendary, stories passed down in whispers among pilots, engineers, and historians. It was a flying paradox, a symbol of ambition, courage, and tragic inefficiency. Pilots returned from missions with tales of narrowly avoided disaster, engines smoldering, wings trembling, and instruments sparking, each story reinforcing the reputation of this aircraft as a nightmare in the skies. Its legacy was cemented not by victories, but by the shared horror and incredulity of those who dared to fly it. Even today, accounts of its flights read like cinematic dramas, a series of near tragedies strung together by sheer human endurance. The air was a theater, and the plane was both actor and antagonist, its flaws dictating the pace and tone of each sortie. There were no triumphs of maneuverability, no grace in combat, only a relentless struggle to maintain control, to coax life from failing machinery, and to survive against both human and mechanical threats. It was a disaster in motion, a testament to human courage against the backdrop of technological failure, and a haunting reminder that not all machines of war are designed for glory. Some exist to test patience, nerves, and the very limits of endurance, and this aircraft was the most extreme embodiment of that principle. Flying this plane was a symphony of terror, frustration, and disbelief. Every takeoff was a gamble, every maneuver, a negotiation, every encounter with an enemy, a test of whether the pilot could survive the unpredictable whims of a machine that seemed determined to fail at the worst possible moment. The psychological strain, the mechanical unreliability, and the ever-present danger combined to create a flight experience that was unforgettable, not for heroism or victory, but for sheer, unrelenting struggle. It was the ultimate exercise in endurance, a dramatic dance with death that left no room for error, and no margin for mercy. Time does not forget failure, especially when that failure so spectacularly defied expectation. This fighter, born from the desperate ambitions of wartime engineers, did not fade quietly into history. Its presence lingered, like a shadow over the airfields it once roared, or sputtered, across. While other planes earned accolades, medals, and admiration for their victories, this aircraft earned a different kind of notoriety, one rooted in humiliation, mechanical treachery, and the courage of those forced to command it despite knowing it might betray them at any moment. Pilots who survived missions recounted stories of engine failures, wing vibrations, and weapons that refused to fire, passing these tales along as grim warnings and, sometimes, as dark humor to soothe nerves. Each anecdote reinforced the stark reality that the plane's existence was less a testament to technological innovation than a lesson in ambition gone tragically awry. Engineers and designers may have intended a fighter capable of altering the tides of battle, but what emerged was a machine that symbolized the perils of hasty construction, compromised testing, and wartime desperation. Its failures were complete, and yet, somehow, it survived long enough to etch its name into the annals of history, not as a hero, but as an enduring cautionary tale. The legacy of this aircraft was etched in the memories of the men who flew it, the ground crews who maintained it, and the enemies who encountered it in the sky. Returning pilots would speak of its peculiar quirks in quiet tones, the way the engines sometimes surged without warning, the way the wings seemed to bend ominously under stress, and the near-constant sense of peril that accompanied every flight. For some, flying it was a crucible, a test of nerves, skill, and survival instinct that left a permanent mark on their psyche. Ground crews, who had labored tirelessly to keep it airworthy, were forced to confront the dissonance between the machine's intended purpose and its real-world performance. They applied every patch, adjustment, and modification they could, yet nothing could transform it into the fighter it was meant to be. The plane became a symbol of frustration and perseverance, a stark reminder that even the most valiant efforts of human ingenuity cannot always overcome flawed design. It became more than a machine, it became a shared experience, a story of collective endurance in the face of inevitable failure. Historians would later recount that its failures were as instructive as any battlefield victory. Manuals, engineering notes, and pilot memoirs all emphasized what went wrong: weight imbalances, underpowered engines, structural weaknesses, and weapons systems that often malfunctioned at the most critical moments. Each flaw, catalogued with painstaking detail, served as a lesson for future aircraft development. While the plane never achieved glory, its infamy ensured that no future generation of engineers could ignore the consequences of hubris, haste, and insufficient testing. Its skeletal remains in museums and archives stand today as a visual reminder of what happens when ambition exceeds practical capability. Rusting fuselages, warped wings, and corroded landing gear are not just relics. They are warnings, cautionary symbols of a machine that tried to do more than it could and failed spectacularly. Yet, paradoxically, there is a strange respect embedded in its story. Despite every flaw, every failed maneuver, and every mechanical betrayal, it flew. Pilots survived sorties that should have ended in disaster, landing on airstrips battered and worn, their hands shaking but their will intact. Each return flight was a small triumph, a testament to human courage in the face of technological inadequacy. The aircraft's failure highlighted not only the flaws in design but the resilience of those who were forced to confront those flaws. In that sense, it became more than a machine. It became a narrative of endurance, courage, and determination under conditions that would have broken a lesser pilot. In the skies, it inspired awe in the wrong ways, a mixture of disbelief, frustration, and grudging admiration for the human spirit that persevered despite near-constant adversity. The plane's infamy also spread beyond its immediate pilots and crews. Enemy forces, initially uncertain whether to treat it as a threat or a joke, eventually catalogued it in intelligence reports as an unreliable and ineffective adversary. Its presence on the battlefield had unintended psychological consequences. While it could not dominate in combat, it reminded allies of the stakes of war, and enemies of the sheer unpredictability of aerial engagement. Pilots on both sides shared stories of witnessing it struggle through maneuvers, engines faltering, and weapons failing, yet somehow continuing its flight. Each observation reinforced its dual legacy, a lesson in failure and a testament to human perseverance. In historical analyses, it became a case study, referenced as an example of what not to do in aircraft design, while also illustrating the bravery and endurance of pilots forced to rely on its flawed systems. Over time, museums, photographs, and faded blueprints preserved the memory of this ill-fated aircraft. Rusted fuselages in abandoned hangars, wings twisted with age, and engines frozen in mid-disrepair tell silent stories of mechanical hubris. Pilots who returned to these relics years later often felt a strange mix of nostalgia and horror, recalling the fear, tension, and adrenaline of every flight. They remembered the cockpit's cramped space, the unresponsive controls, and the constant, gnawing awareness that disaster could strike without warning. These preserved machines became living history lessons, tools for reflection on both human courage and the consequences of engineering miscalculation. Even as decades passed, the aircraft continued to captivate imaginations, not as a symbol of victory but as a monument to the thin line between innovation and catastrophe. Its story also resonates with engineers, designers, and aviation enthusiasts today. Every bolt, every rivet, every warped wing panel carries with it a narrative of ambition, failure, and endurance. Students of aeronautical engineering analyze its flaws to better understand weight distribution, engine reliability, and structural stress. Veterans and historians recount its trials as cautionary tales, emphasizing the importance of rigorous testing, meticulous planning, and the dangers of haste under pressure. The plane's legacy is multifaceted. It is at once a symbol of failure, a lesson in resilience, and a testament to the courage of those who navigated its many dangers. By examining what went wrong, future aircraft could avoid repeating its mistakes, ensuring that history remembers it as a warning rather than an excuse. Even in popular culture and documentary retellings, this fighter continues to inspire fascination. Its story is cinematic in nature. A machine designed to conquer the skies but hampered by its own imperfections, pilots confronting mechanical betrayal at every turn, and the thin thread of human endurance that allowed any mission to succeed. Writers, historians, and filmmakers use it as a lens through which to examine the broader realities of war. The tension between ambition and capability, the human cost of technological shortcomings, and the resilience required to confront overwhelming adversity. The plane may not have achieved battlefield fame, but it achieved something arguably more enduring, a place in the collective memory of history, an emblem of perseverance against nearly insurmountable odds, and a reminder that sometimes courage is measured not in victories, but in survival against a relentless adversary, even when that adversary is a machine of one's own making. The aircraft's physical remnants evoke powerful imagery. Wings hang twisted in abandoned hangars, metal fatigued and corroded, engines frozen mid-cough, instruments covered in dust and time. Pilots who revisit these relics often describe a mix of emotions: fear rekindled, respect for their own endurance, and an almost eerie sense of communion with the past. It is a tangible representation of the struggle endured thousands of feet above the ground, a silent testament to the countless flights that pushed both men and machine to their limits. These relics are more than historical artifacts. They are symbols of the human spirit confronting relentless mechanical failure, each dent, crack, and twisted panel narrating stories of fear, courage, and perseverance. Ultimately, this aircraft earned a form of immortality, not through triumph but through infamy. It is remembered because it challenged the conventional ideas of what a fighter plane should be, because it tested the limits of human patience and courage, and because it serves as a stark reminder that technology, however ambitious, is meaningless without reliability. Its legacy endures in the stories of pilots who faced it, in the manuals and reports that dissected it, and in the skeletal frames that linger in museums, silent yet eloquent witnesses to history. It teaches lessons that extend beyond aviation, that ambition without prudence can lead to disaster, that courage is often measured by endurance rather than triumph, and that even in failure, there is a story worth remembering. As a final reflection, it is impossible to ignore the paradoxical respect this fighter commands. While it is ridiculed for its failures, it is simultaneously revered for the fortitude it demanded from those who flew it. Each sortie was a test of nerves, each landing a small victory, each engine cough a reminder of the precarious balance between life and disaster. Its flaws are catalogued, studied, and debated, yet its presence remains a haunting emblem of the human struggle to confront and overcome adversity. In this way, the aircraft transcends its role as a failed weapon. It becomes a symbol of resilience, a dramatic testament to the courage required to face the impossible, and a permanent fixture in the collective consciousness of aviation history. It is a reminder that not all legends are born from success. Some are carved from the grit and determination required to endure failure again and again, high above the clouds, in a machine that seemed almost determined to betray its pilot at every turn.